Shabbat Shalom, my friends. First of all, I'd just like to apologize briefly. My voice is not at all what it could, should, ought to be. We're dealing with that, and I'm sorry for the discomfort it might cause for you to hear the strain in the voice. We are dealing with it. I apologize. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Okay, so it's a very, very, very busy weekend. Friday, March 17th, always March 17th, is St. Patrick's Day, and the Jewish community has a very interesting and very positive set of relationships with Ireland, which I am not going to go into today. There's enough going on. Our Sedra is VaYakhel-Pekude, Exodus 35:1 to 40:38. This combined Sedra is the last Sedra of the book of Exodus. So Saturday morning we have a Siyyum, a concluding celebration, special food, little bit of drink, whatever we do. I like herring, but fine. To mark happiness that we finished the second book of the Torah this year. We'll come back to it next year. And next week we begin Vayikra, the book of Leviticus. Therefore, there's more going on, okay? This Shabbat, we have an additional Torah reading called Parshat HaChodesh. That's because this coming Thursday is the first day of the new month of Nisan, which means April 5th is Passover. Got that? Okay. So we have Parshat HaChodesh, Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 20, and that is all about the setting up of the basic structure of the Passover observance in the Exodus text. After Moses delivers this address, supposedly 2 weeks before the actual Exodus, get the timing? Then the 10th plague comes, the slaying of the firstborn, and the process continues. So, we have Parshat HaChodesh, the beginning of the new month. We have the ending of the book of Exodus. There is a lot going on. And don't forget the Siyyum. So we go right into a study of our closing Sedra. Freedom is a funny thing. In Egypt, we were slaves to Pharaoh. We built storehouses. I assume we did a good job of doing that. Hard labor. Pharaoh was seen as a god and saw himself as a god. In the book of Ezekiel, we have an assumed quote, something that Pharaoh is said to have said, but we have no record of that. Pharaoh saying in Ezekiel, "My Nile is my own. I made it for myself." Pharaoh. Shai Held references a medieval midrash which then places more words in Pharaoh's mouth. "I have no need of God. I created myself." This is how the rabbis and the later authors of the Bible viewed how Pharaoh viewed himself. So the prolonged battle between Moses and Pharaoh, described in the book of Exodus, is portrayed as a war between God, for whom Moses and Aaron were serving as spokespeople, and Pharaoh, who actually believed that he embodied a god. Titans facing off against each other. And the Pharaoh god knew that the best way to crush his slaves was to work them beyond all reason. When the slaves complained, Pharaoh doubled their burdens. Either they would die, or they would lose all sense of agency, of control over their lives. They would therefore become somehow subhuman. They wouldn't be able to mount any kind of a rebellion against their God Master. In the text that we read today, the Israelites, end of the book of Exodus, have now crossed the Red Sea and had been standing at Sinai. They were no longer slaves. They could make choices, decisions, and taste what freedom was all about. They now were on a journey that would literally transform a vast part of the world. So Harold points out that there were two countervailing forces expressed within our Sedra. Countervailing forces that were yoked together in the material that we read. The first force was Shabbat, the Sabbath, a day of rest so powerfully important that if you willfully violated Shabbat, you were confronted with the death penalty. We know the principal themes of Shabbat. We all know that. Not going to go into it in depth, but they deserve brief mention here. A, there is a God who created the cosmos, a God who is infinitely powerful, beyond the challenge of any human being. B, this God mandated that once every 7 days we are to refrain from all labor. On the Sabbath, Shabbat, we rest. On the Shabbat, we pull off the garments of ordinariness and cloak ourselves with a fringed garment that speaks of holiness. On the Shabbat, we recognize that despite our fondest ego-driven wishes, we ultimately control very little of our world. And so we embrace with trust the loving presence of God. Not only do we rest our bodies and Shabbat, we rest our souls as well. That's Shabbat. Such rest comes to the free. The Shabbat is a refutation of all that the Israelites experienced in Egypt, the brutal harshness of slavery. The Shabbat is meant to be an astonishing blend of beauty and of spiritual richness. There are no taskmasters cracking their whips on Shabbat. Only a sense of calm that brings us oneg and simcha. But at the very same time, our Sedra brings that countervailing force, the realization that true freedom demands a great deal from each and every one of us. When we were slaves in Egypt, we labored to build Pharaoh's storehouses, and we did a good job. But now we read that in our freedom, we are obligated in our freedom to build a sanctuary, a tabernacle, an ark of the covenant, structures that were intended to promote connection between an infinite God and finite, fragile human beings. We are obligated to build an earthly dwelling place for God. Please notice, in our freedom, we had to go back to work again. But this time, the work is an expression of our freedom, an expression of what we owe to God as our part of the covenant. My friends, freedom is complicated. As Jews understand it, freedom does not mean a license to do whatever our passions entice us to do. According to the covenant, the free person has an astonishing array of ethical obligations. No, you can't turn a blind eye to the suffering. You must struggle to alleviate the pain felt by others. No, you cannot abuse others. No, you must not tolerate a social order that perpetuates pervasive, massive inequalities in education, in healthcare, in security, etc. Freedom means that we must now go to work to build institutions that protect and enhance human dignity. Okay, not to build storehouses, physical or ideological, for the pharaohs of our own day. Freedom means that we must be willing to go to war against those who would seek to impose upon us a view of the world that is anathema to us. If that happens, we are called to war, to go to war against those whose values ultimately promote our loss of freedom, to go to war against those who want to harden our hearts and to shut down our consciences. We are not free to tolerate that. Do you remember the full text of Moses' demand of Pharaoh? I bet you do. Let my people go. But you remember the rest of that phrase? It's found in the Haggadah. Let my people go so that they might serve me. We will sit at our Seder tables in 2 weeks and read the first part of the demand, and I have to tell you, most frequently ignore the second part. Freedom demands hard work from us. But the difference between the hard work of Egypt and the hard work of the covenant is the purpose of that work. Are we being called upon to crush and to destroy, or are we being called upon to enhance, to uplift, even to sanctify? So we left Egypt in order to go to work. And we left Egypt in order to sanctify the beauty of creation. Whether our focus is on our crushing concerns for the state of Israel, our crushing concerns for this United States of ours, our crushing concern for Ukraine and for so many other places in the world, we now are free to accept the painful and complex challenges of our day. So we labor to build sanctuaries of the Spirit. So we labor to create weekly islands of transcendence. And we labor to validate what we understand that God demands of us. Shabbat and the escape from slavery. Shabbat and the assumption of obligation and commitments. That's what our freedom means. Have a great Shabbat. Enjoy the celebration tomorrow, and see you next week.